I have a Minolta MC Rokkor-X PF 50mm f1.7 lens that I'm going to be disassembling. You can see that this lens has the new metal and rubber gripping ring design of the Rokkor-X lenses, but it's still an MC lens. So optically it's much more similar to the older Rokkor MC PF 50mm with the metal body design. Now this is the 1.4, but it's got the metal body design, rather than the 50mm just regular Rokkor-X, which doesn't have the PF designation. It's also quite a bit larger than this later just regular Rokkor-X, the MD, and does have some few external differences, and it's pretty significantly heavier as well. I'm going to be disassembling this lens to take it apart fully, be able to clean the aperture blades, and remove all the individual body sections so that those can also be cleaned. So to start with, I'm going to go in from the front of the lens and get access to the front of the aperture blades. And right on the name ring here, there are two spots for a spanning wrench on the outside. You see, this name ring is unfortunately made of plastic, so it does have some cheaper components as well that it's using. Now I can go in, and there are two sets of rings here. There's this inner ring which has all these grooves on it next to the front glass element here, and then there's this outer ring going around here which has just two grooves, one there and one over here. That is actually what is holding the entire front glass assembly in place. So I just want to remove the outer piece, and it can be a little bit difficult to reach because it's kind of down in here. So I'm going to remove this filter holding ring first, this black ring that goes around here. I'm going to remove that first so that I can get access to the front glass element a little easier. So this ring is just held in place by 4 screws going around here on the top. Now I have a little bit better access to get to the next piece. So I'm going to use the spanning wrench and just get in the 2 divots here and here to try to get this outer section undone. Okay, so now I can just lift off the entire front glass piece. Now I have access to the aperture blades on the front side as well. So I can go in, they don't seem to be moving quite correctly. So something in there is causing some problems because they're not closing up all the way. So we'll have to figure out what's going wrong there. But if there's any oil on them, you could try to clean them in this state right now. But I'm also going to remove the back glass piece to get access to the back of the aperture blades. So I'm going to flip over the lens, and now looking at the back of the lens on the back glass group, there are two rings. And you only want to use the outer ring, use the spanning wrench on the outer ring with the 2 divots there and there to just unscrew this entire back glass assembly. So that just lifts right out. Now I have access to both sides of the aperture blades. So now what I'm going to do is just to remove the entire diaphragm mechanism that's sitting down in here and actually contains all the little blades and things. So I'm going to flip the lens back over, and on the front side of the lens I'm going to undo these other 4 screws that were part of the 8 screws going around before. So I'm going to undo these other 4 and just be able to lift out the entire diaphragm assembly. You can see that there's also this metal ring going around here. I'm just going to remove that. And now I can slide out the entire diaphragm assembly. Unlike the MD rocker, the diaphragm assembly is separate from the focusing rings, which is very nice because you can really easily clean this. It's a very simple piece, so it's very easy to clean, and you don't have to worry about the oil from the focusing assembly or messing up the focusing at all while you're cleaning that. So that's a nice difference than the MD Rokkor-X 50mm. Now I'm going to go in and start removing some of the body sections, and this is also where the MC rocker, which I have here, is a little bit different than the MD rocker. As you can see on the back, there are no screws going around here. There's only a few screws in here, but those just remove this black metal plate and don't really do much. So what is actually holding this in place is this silver ring going around here on the edge of the mounting plate, and it has 3 little slotted screws going around there, which I can just undo and then remove this entire silver ring. And I'm going to just try to undo these slightly and leave them in because they're a real pain to try to get back into their correct position after you remove them fully. Okay, so that just lifts right out. And now I also have access to, I spin this around so that it's at 1.7. The aperture control ring is going around here, and it has these 4 holes going around where you can see little screws down here. And this is actually holding on the mounting plate, so I'm going to undo these 4 screws and lift off the mounting plate. Okay, so this entire assembly is now separate. So what I just separated is the focusing mechanism here, which includes both the focusing ring that you grab onto and then the actual mechanism that's used to focus the lens in and out, from the mounting plate and the aperture control ring, as well as this body section that has the depth of field scale on it right here. So I'm going to set aside the focusing mechanism for a second and get those screws out of there and just concentrate on the mounting plate disassembly because there could be some issues down here, and I want to remove the other 2 body sections to be able to clean this part a little bit better. Before I do that though, let me just show how this works in here. So if I bring back the diaphragm mechanism, you can see it has just a simple lever here. It opens and closes the aperture, and that lever goes down into this little slot right here. It goes like that, so that when this piece of metal in here moves back and forth, and it's kind of held open with a spring mechanism over here, just these wires, when it moves back and forth, it opens and closes the aperture. And there are 2 ways that can happen. It's either you actually hit this lever and directly move this bar back and forth, that's the stop down lever on the outside, or you move the aperture control ring. So let me set this to be fully open. And when I do that, you can see that there's a little post here that's going along this curve in here, this metal curve piece. So as I gradually step this down from fully open to now fully closed, you can see that little post move along that curve in there, and that moves this this bar back and forth inside the lens. So that's how it's actually being coupled to, how the aperture control ring is being coupled to the diaphragm mechanism to control the aperture size. And this is actually a place where there can be a lot of problems because this little curve in here can get out of alignment, and then you have to readjust it. But I'll talk more about that when I'm putting the lens back together. So for now, I'm going to flip the lens back over to look down at the mounting plate, and I'm going to remove the aperture control ring from the lens. And to do that, I have to remove that curved metal piece, the one that was defining the curve. And it's held in place by 2 screws right here. So I'm going to undo these 2 screws and kind of slide the curve piece out. There we go. Now if I flip this over, there's nothing holding on the aperture control ring anymore. But when I remove this, I just want to be careful because there is the little ball bearing type thing, and it's, I believe, let me see where it is. It's over on this side right here, near the 50, I believe. So I'm going to try to remove, just lift this off and okay. And you can see that the ball bearing rests on the aperture control ring, which I've just removed. So it's right there in a little indentation for it. So I'm going to set that aside. So I can clean the aperture control ring now without having to worry about getting any of the other parts dirty while I'm cleaning it. And I can also, I have this mounting plate assembly. And there are a few more things that I can talk about in here. In this mounting plate assembly, if the aperture is not moving and the diaphragm mechanism itself is in good condition, there's no oil on the blades or anything, it could be that the friction, there's friction in here or something's broken in here. So one of the springs is not working, or there's too much friction to prevent this from moving correctly. So that's one possible cause. The other cause, like I said, could be that that curve that I just removed it with the aperture control ring is not adjusted properly. And there are a few other pieces that you can remove from here, but they're not very important. You can see there's 4 screws going down here. You kind of had to move the aperture control ring back and forth to access these 2. And that actually will detach the metal mounting plate itself. So this mounting thing with the bayonet mount coupling, that's what that detaches. And the only important thing is that you reattach it in the correct position. And the way I kind of remember that is that the post here is opposite of this little notch on this other side. So you can see that little notch. You kind of line this up so they're opposite. But that's not very exciting. And the other one you can remove is this little black metal plate going around here, which is held in place by 3 screws. But again, that's, I think, a mainly cosmetic piece, so it doesn't really have much purpose. And unfortunately, there's no way to detach this section here, which has the depth of field scale and those little numbers on there, from the rest of this body piece. So that's what you could take apart, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to instead just briefly talk about the focusing mechanism here. And the way this piece works is that as you move the focusing ring back and forth, you move this inner metal section, which is what actually holds the optics and everything, up and down. And there's only one really exciting thing we can do with this, and that's remove the focusing ring to clean it a little bit better. So the part you actually see with the numbers and the rubber gripping ring. And the way that's held in place is these 3 screws going around here. So I'm just going to undo these 3. But unless you need to clean the focusing ring, you probably shouldn't remove it, because then you have to go out and focus the lens correctly back at infinity, because there's no real way to tell how the lens should be focused at infinity after you remove this. So that just removes those pieces, and these screws do have little washers as well. And now I have the focusing ring, the actual focusing body section separate from the focusing mechanism here. So now what we've done is we've taken all the the optics, the front glass piece and the back glass piece out of the lens, and also separated all of the mechanical parts from the main body section. So we have the aperture control here, and then the focusing mechanism here. And we also have all these body sections just on their own, like the aperture control ring, this silver ring that goes around the back, so that those can be cleaned. Now I'm going to start on the reassembly of this lens. And the reassembly it's harder than the MD Rokkor-X, but it has a few difficult points, but it's not too bad overall. So to start the reassembly, I'm going to start with the back mounting plate here and just reattach the focusing mechanism first. And the focusing mechanism has this little section over here with the post going up into the intersection of the focusing, and this little kind of screw looking thing over there. And that screw thing lines up with the depth of field scale, so that these screws go down into this little indentation down there. So I'm just going to slide that in place, and then there are 4 screw holes on the back that have to get lined up. So they're going around here, 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 and here. Okay, now I'm going to get the aperture control ring back into its general position. So I'm going to slide the aperture control ring so that it has this post section going backwards towards the back of the lens, and it has the numbers over here by the depth of field scale, and it should just slide over there. But I also have to do 2 other things. I have to get the ball bearing in its spot so that it rests in little indentation. Let me see where it is. Right there. And so it's pressed up against these little grooves right there. And I have to get this metal ring that defines the curve of how the aperture moves back in place. And this piece is going to screw in place like this into the aperture control ring, and then stick in to the center of the lens through this section in here, like this, and move back and forth like that. So to start with, I'm going to get the ball bearing in place. So I'm going to get the ring here, the aperture control ring, and just set the ball bearing where it needs to be. And I'm going to find the grooves on here and just slide that over. Okay, so it should be making that clicking sound. Now I have to worry about getting this metal piece back in place. So on the inside of the lens, I'm going to find where that little post is. See, the post is right there. And I want to have this curve like this so that it has the higher section. You can see it has a little bend, the higher section going up. I'm going to slide this behind that post so that the part of the metal piece should be sticking out right here. So now I can kind of line this up so that it is, I might have to hold this over a little bit. There are 2 screw holes right there and there, but as you can see, they're just slots, so there's no actual position that it has to be locked to. And that's something that allows you to adjust how the aperture moves. So I'm just going to lock this down into some arbitrary position right now, and then later I can go back and adjust this if things aren't moving correct. That's probably what was wrong with the lens before, where everything mechanically and the aperture blades looked great. They were very clean and everything. There weren't any mechanical problems with the lens, but I suspect that the focusing curve here was not correct. And I think, so to kind of test and make sure that and get this curve lined up correctly, I'm going to put back in the diaphragm mechanism. So I'm going to slide this into place, and it just is going to use any 4 screws up here with this metal ring to lock it down. But there's, in the back of the lens, I have to line this up so that it slides correctly into place down here. So it goes into the little pocket of the stop down lever over here. And this is another area where you can actually adjust the lens, is by spinning this diaphragm mechanism around. So I'm going to set this to be fully open right now. And I'm going to put this metal piece back on, get that lined up. And now just go in with any 4 alternating screws and get this started. Now I can test this out, and you can see it's got the same problem it had before, where I go down and get to about f8 and it doesn't really do anything. So note that from the disassembly before that there's nothing mechanically wrong with the diaphragm mechanism here. So what is actually wrong is this little curve, and it's hard to see right now because all the components are back in place. But what's going on is that this little curve in here is somehow not properly lined up. So I'm going to set this down to be at the smallest aperture, and I'm going to just undo one of these a bit. And if I push over this side, you should see the aperture move back and forth based on this. So there, that's a lot better already. Okay. Now I'm going to check one thing. Check that it actually moves correctly. So just by adjusting that curve, I could control how the aperture opens and closes, even though it looked like there was nothing wrong with the lens. And that's probably going to happen when you put back together the lens, that you won't get the curve right the first time. So now I'm going to just finish up with the reassembly of the back of the lens. And I'm going to start by just putting back on this silver ring here. It just slides on place and then has these 3 slotted screws going around that lock it down. Okay. Now I'm just going to screw in the back glass piece. So it just screws in place. And I can use the spanning wrench on the outer 2 little divots to lock this down. So that has the back reassembly complete. I'm going to just put on this lens cap and flip this over to start on the front. And the front reassembly, the only difficult part of this is that you would have to focus the lens back to infinity. So the problem is that once I took off the focusing ring here, I no longer know where to reattach it so that when it's set to infinity over here, that the lens is correctly optically focused at infinity. So I'm just going to put the focusing ring back in place right now, and it reattaches with 3 screws going around here. There's 3 screws with the little washers. I'm going to get those in place but not tighten everything down completely yet. Okay, and I'm just going to loosen these up a little bit so that the focusing ring still turns independently of actually moving the intersection here. This is the focusing mechanism. Now I'm just going to put in this front glass piece, and I'm just doing it in this order to explain how you would focus it back to infinity. So I'm putting back together the entire lens except for the front element, or except for the name ring and the front black ring. So I'm going to have the entire lens assembled and be able to just focus it back to infinity very easily. I'm going to get that in place. So focusing the lens back to infinity is pretty easy. You can see I have the entire lens put together except for just a few, the name ring and those pieces. So what I want to do is take the camera, or take this lens outside and mount it on my camera as it is, like this, in this condition. And what I want to do is focus this intersection here that has the optics in it so that it's correctly focused at infinity, so that when I'm looking at some very distant object, it's at infinity correctly focused. And I can do that by moving the intersection around like this, just with a screwdriver or something, or tightening this down a little bit, and then moving the focusing ring to control the intersection. And then once I would have the intersection focused to infinity, I would spin the focusing ring around here to infinity and then tighten this section down. So that now when it's optically at infinity, the focusing ring is also showing that it is at infinity. So I'm just kind of saying that is infinity. So it's very easy to focus the lens back to infinity. You don't have to take anything apart separately on this particular lens. Continuing on with the reassembly, I'm going to add the filter holder, and it has 4 little pockets going around here on the intersection that go on top of the screws that were holding in the diaphragm assembly, and then it itself is held in place by the other 4 screws in this circle. Finally, to complete the reassembly, it's going to attach this name ring. It just screws in place into the filter ring holder that I just reattached. And I can lock it down with the spanning wrench in the 2 divots there and there. Alright, so everything seems to be okay now on this lens. It's opening and closing properly, focusing in and out properly. So, looks good. So that's the Minolta MC Rokkor-X PF 50mm f1.7 lens. Overall, the lens isn't too bad to take apart, but there are definitely some things that might require some fiddling around with to get properly working, like the little curve in there. So although it does look similar to the MD Rokkor-X 50mm, it's actually much closer to the regular Rokkor PF 50mm, the MC Rokkor, with the metal body design internally. And that it has a few more annoying things than that lens, but it's not too much worse to take apart. So if there are things wrong with the lens, it definitely can be repaired, and it's probably something simple like that little curve getting out of a line, or there's oil on the aperture blades. So it's definitely a lens that you should try to repair if you have a copy that's not working correctly, and it's a great lens to shoot with.